Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Beautiful Struggle. I'm Shanice.
I'm Greg Goodman.
TJ Goodman.
And I'm Lauren.
The Black Advancement is a nonprofit organization that seeks to create unity within the Black community through action and dialogue. Today, we're going to be discussing the topic of the wealth gap. This is a second of a series of 3, which discusses the wealth gap and why it exists. So we'll go ahead and we're going to start off with TJ. He's going to give his reasons of why he thinks the wealth gap exists.
All right, thanks, Shanice. So I did a little bit of research for this. So I'm going to lay out, I guess, what I was thinking when I was doing the research. So the first thing that I was thinking is, all right, well, when did slavery end, right? Because we all know that you can't accumulate any wealth while you're working for free. So automatically we're starting off behind, right? So slavery, I guess technically ended in 1865. I think it was actually really closer to 1866 because it was in December at some point. So from that point forward, I started to try to understand, well, what happened to the Black community after that, right? What took place after the emancipation? So the first thing was Reconstruction, which actually seemed like it was helping us, trying to undo some of the things that the slavery had done to the community. I know it was expensive for the government, so eventually they ended up pushing it by the wayside. But the crazy part about Reconstruction is once the government couldn't pay for it anymore, I'm trying to remember what they called the South. It was either rebellious or Reconstruction. I don't remember what it was at this point, but they were very, very, very determined to undo everything that was done in Reconstruction, right? So they worked hard at it, really hard, and that period lasted a whole lot longer than Reconstruction. Reconstruction was maybe a decade or so. This has probably not stopped, right? So some of the things that came out of that campaign by the South are things like Jim Crow, segregation, the loss of our voting rights, the spreading of white supremacist ideology, which was even perpetuated by the media back in those times, and I guess still is to some degree, right? So part of Reconstruction was that you guys have all heard that 40 acres and a mule concept, basically reparations. So it's like, okay, well, that seemed like it was in motion. What happened there? Because that was trying to even things up. So basically Lincoln was assassinated and Johnson decided, this is it's a capitalist society and we don't give away land. That goes against the tenets of capitalism. So, sorry, but we're not going to do that. However, on the back end, he ends up passing, the Homestead Acts and giving away a bunch of free land to people going out west to settle, right? So in the end, well, I guess the very next really, really hard shot that the Black community took was the National Housing Act, right? That was really after the Great Depression, where they tried to make housing affordable to like the working class people because we're coming out of a really bad period in the entire world. And of course, they excluded Black people from that as well, right? By a process called redlining. So when I look at all this, what I take away from it is us just getting a rung lower and the gap widening and widening, because every single instance where there was an opportunity to try to close it, that was completely destroyed by, and I'll call it the system. So we had slavery, we had the reversal of Reconstruction, with the Homestead Acts. Even despite all the hurdles, when Black people did amass something, that was met with terror, and violence, and destruction. And then in the end, you have redlining. So I guess the 3 main things that I saw, the common theme is, government supported oppression, right? That seems to be the common theme. So when you've got the weight and the power of an entire nation's government against you, it's very, very difficult to ascend. So that's one big thing I took from it. The other one is that you need capital in order to make capital. right? We were denied that
Mhm.
for quite a long time. And I guess to make the point, I'll just say it. We'll give a really, really easy example. So if one person has $10, another person has $100 or 1,000, we'll say 1,000, and both of you make 100% profit, you've got 20 and they've got 2,000.
Exactly.
So even though you doubled your money, the gap between you and that other person is still widening because they start off with so much more. So, there's that. I'll just say that. There's that. And the very last thing is, and there's a point to this, I promise. When I was a kid, I used to play cards with a friend of mine. I wasn't any good at cards. I didn't know any of the rules of the game, but a friend of mine supposedly knew the rules, right? So we're playing cards, and as the game is going on, he's changing the rules. I was like, oh, you didn't know lucky sevens? Oh, you didn't know deuces were wild? Oh, I'm sorry. So I ended up losing, obviously, every time. And that is really kind of been the story here from what my research shows and the reason for the wealth gap existing. Rules changing, legislation put in place to keep Blacks suppressed. Maybe even if their goal isn't to keep us suppressed, it is to kind of hold you there for a second until they can get further ahead, right? And giving access to capital while we had no access to it.
Awesome. Those are awesome reasons. Go ahead, Lauren.
So I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I wrote a paper that was about the connection to education, the importance of education. And it kind of really talks about how we are teaching students their place in society through the active education. So some students learn ideas about critical thinking and how to, imagine and become a certain class of people, while other students don't necessarily have the same educational experience and how that impacts their ability to pretty much reproduce whatever social system they are in. So poor kids learn to be poor, middle class students learn how to be poor, and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to read a little bit about it. So one of the authors, Moshkovitz, details the transformative power of education. Education should seek to add sophistication to student understanding as a way to develop skills to articulate complex values and experiences. So you're going to learn more about how to, articulate your own idea. This is how students, particularly from oppressed communities, can learn to taste the power of education, a power that, because of their sex, gender, and country of origin, is not always assumed of them. As you can imagine, the ability to think critically, or being taught how to do that in a formal way, is really what I'm talking about. It has always been a dangerous idea for those that are oppressed. As students begin to sharpen their critical thinking skills, they are simultaneously working to develop a language of transcendence while beginning the development of critique. So this also challenges capitalism, right? Because Bosengentis describes the conflict of critique through the tension of capitalism. They say that capitalist economy, our critique of the capitalist economy is simple enough. In the workplace and in schools, it's dominated by the lust for profits and domination rather than human need. So a lot of us are always talk about this, about what we learn in school, why we learn it. And really the idea is that we're teaching students to have the, have this big, attachment to money and profits. They say that although we acquire to a democratic republic where each citizen has an equal standing, capitalism works in conflict with that ideal. Capitalism incentivizes a culture of unbridled profits created by high productivity and low wages. This system is held intact by the creation of a class of owners, which holds the majority of the wealth and decision-making power in its system. This class of people, characterized as owners and managers, represent a small percentage of the population. Workers, on the other hand, are the majority and controlled by the small minority, while their profits are given to the owners and the managers. You can think of this system as a ladder. The further up one climbs, to becoming an owner or a manager, the more agency and decision-making power they gain. So in this context, the workers must believe that they can gain agency by climbing up the ladder. Once they reach the top of the ladder, they too are justified in their profits, in taking profits from the workers. So as you can see, our whole economic system is really built upon a triangle model, right? It's built so that we have a majority of people that are not going to be able to have wealth, and some people are. And so that's the design of the system, and the educational system really supports having a wealth gap. So just in conclusion, it says, in order for capitalism to sustain itself, it works in tandem with education to propel the proverbial race to the top, which is even probably, as Shanice knows, the name of a funding source that they have in education as well, the race to the top. So several scholars have hypothesized, however, that because of social structures like classism, patriarchy, and racism, not all students are educated similarly. Particularly for marginalized groups, their education perpetuates social reproduction by limiting their personal and systemic agency. In schooling, agency is really described as the activities, the kinds of things that they learn, and all of that is standardized. So while it may work, that standardization may work for some students in the system, it doesn't work for all. And because the system is designed that a majority of students are really going to continue to be what their social economic status has always been, education and racism and classism and white supremacy all kind of work together to make sure that we do the same thing over and over. So I just wanted to kind of make that point that it's not necessarily just one thing that causes a wealth gap or a difference. It's really the design of the system to continue to have things the way that they are, and it's working. So that kind of was the research, what I really found out. So.
Well, I'm gonna continue off with why I think the wealth gap exists. First, like TJ said, historical things that were put in place, systematic things that has affected Black communities throughout the span of time, starting with slavery and the finishing, I would say, of Reconstruction, because as you said, there was, after the change of presidency, we have Johnson, and Johnson signed kind of like a treaty with the South to make the South rise again. So then you had the Jim Crow laws, the Black codes, which through the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, the modern civil rights movement, that was supposed to, quote unquote, make it fair. So that's when that voting right was passed in 1965. Black people were granted, quote unquote, full citizenship. Since then, we learned that it's still kind of like the Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, but never really equal between Blacks and white. We can look at, like Lauren said, education, how we are, when you look at the education gap there, we're talking about as far as standardized tests, Black people are the lowest on the standardized tests, and we'll have a discussion about the education gap, but I want to make sure, that is something that is a big part of obtaining wealth, going to college, being able to support your family, owning a home, which most Black people do not own homes, and be able to create generational wealth. And so if you think about it in terms of time, if we say 1965 was the time that Black people, quote unquote, got their full citizens' rights, versus 1600s, when white people have entered the native land and started to make rules that kind of made them to advance while we are slowly climbing the ladder. If we have only a certain amount of time, just from 1965 to 2022 versus 400 years of obtaining wealth and gaining wealth and having that generational wealth passed down to generation to generation, we haven't had time to really accumulate anything. And when I really think of it, I just think from probably our parents to us to our children, that's the only time that our generation really had time to accumulate wealth. And then if you think about the mass incarnation of Black people, the second Jim Crow, as some people will call it, especially Black men, we don't have, like when you think about the leadership of the home and the fostering of family, we don't have all of that in our community. And then education, when we go through the education system, we don't learn about how to pay your bills. We don't learn about how to invest money. We don't learn that life insurance is important so that you can build that generational wealth, leave something for your children to go on to their children. So there's so many things, in my opinion, that are holding us back, that systemically repeats to hold us back. And that's why it's so hard for us to gain that generational wealth. So I'm gonna end right there, but we can, when we come back to the full discussion, we all can kind of give feedback to each other. All right, Greg, it's on you.
All right, well, most things are already covered, so I'm gonna keep this rather short. The wealth gap simply comes down to one word, and that is ownership. If you don't have the ability to own anything and build upon those things, then you'll never succeed in a country based on capitalism, because in order to get capital, you need capital. So it's just not given to you, unless, of course, there's plenty of examples. Well, I'll say this, especially for Blacks, there is no giving of capital. Okay, there's been many times throughout history that Shanice and TJ also covered, right after the Civil War, where they had where Lincoln had signed the 40 acres and a mule bill, whatever it's called, I don't remember. But whenever that was signed up, it was immediately rejected, which means you had to start back over from ground zero. And then once again, time goes on, we get our footing a little bit, not enough to actually own anything, but we get our footing a little bit. And then boom, World War II. Right after that, they have the GI Bills and everything else to ensure that white soldiers that came back from the war got land not only for free, they also had low interest rates on all of these things. We're also discluded from that. So we have not had any handouts at all. And even back then, at that time, because the war had took so many fathers in the white community, that's where they instituted welfare. And welfare was not a thing that was looked down upon until we became a part of it, which was several years later, after it really didn't even help like it's supposed to help anymore. But point being is, between home ownership and just ownership of ideas and inventions, we've been cut out of. We've had some of the most amazing inventions in this country, but what we don't have is the patent to any of those inventions.
Right.
So we've been unallowed to build wealth based on ownership, and that is the way you build wealth in this country, is ownership. And I'm not talking about the Bill Gates level wealth. I'm talking about regular common wealth, as in you have something to pass on to your children wealth. We have none of that. Well, at least we had none of that. We're starting to get some now, but like I said, comparing 40 years to 400, there's no way to catch up. Not at this rate.
Right.
And which brings me back to Lauren's point when it comes to education. And this is why education is important. And this is why they're trying to keep critical race theory out of school, because these are the things that critical race theory teaches you. How white people got ahead and how they kept ahead, and why we're not as horrible as it seems. Because if you teach just the kids, to quote TJ, kids only care about fair. And if they understand that these things were unfair, then this will change the system when they become adults. So they don't want that taught to children. They definitely don't want to talk to our children, and they surely don't want to talk to their children. And it's not even based on, oh, my child might feel bad. And even if he does, I mean, since when did y'all start caring how kids feel? When did that start in America? No one cares how kids feel. They've done nothing about gun laws, and there's all kinds of kid shootings. But I digress, or school shootings. But I digress. That is not my point. The one thing that I've learned throughout all my research is that Black people in this country have been put, the way I like to word it is, we've been put in the scarecrow role in the Wiz. They've locked us into a position where you can't win you can't break even, and you can't get out of the game.
Amen, brother.
So that's where I'll end mine.
The most hopeless song that I've ever heard.
Yeah, so now let's bring us to our full discussion. Does anybody have any feedback off of what we discussed? I wanted to add one more thing too. And then we do also have a wage gap, like how much you get paid gap between Black people and white people too, as well as women and men. So to accumulate wealth, like you guys said, we need money. And if there's a huge disparity between what I make and what someone that has my same experience is making, then that's going to uneven it out as well.
I agree. And speaking of capital, the thing is, let's just say person A and person B, both of them are living, check to check. They don't really have enough money to save. If person A is able to go to the bank and get a loan, they're given capital. You can use that to your benefit, make money, and then pay them back. If person B is not given those same opportunities, it's extremely difficult to do anything other than just survive. And that's really, I guess, what I saw as a common thread, common theme. I mean, the Homestead Act is a perfect example, right? On the one hand, they're giving away land to people, and on the other hand, they're denying giving land to Black folks, like they said they were. And actually, I think, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that some of the slaves, after being freed, took over those plantations that they were working at. And they were basically booted out, like after the Reconstruction period.
Yeah,
they were given back as reparations to the slave owners.
Right.
And I would have another point to add to that. You have banks like Wells Fargo that accepted slaves as capital for loans. So they did come out and apologize for that. But you look at Wells Fargo as a bank that still continues to exist today, and they accepted human beings as a form of capital for their for their loans. So you can just see that if the person was able to gain greater wealth off the back of having this human capital, that slave owner or whomever, they were able to prosper in America, and Wells Fargo was intimately involved in that as well. So, just something to think about, how these companies are still around, still continuing to profit because of their previous practices from the past.
Yeah, and speaking of banking, even way back, I think it was right after, it was right around the same time that they reversed the 40 acres and a mule thing. And Blacks were still working, but they weren't working. They were getting paid, but they weren't really getting paid. They were getting money, but not enough to be actual sustainable. But because the other banks would not deal with them, they opened up a bank called the Freeman's Bank for Blacks. This was a white-owned bank. Now, this is another way that the system has screwed over Black people. I don't know if anyone covered this, but at that time, all the Blacks were generally putting their money into this one bank. What that bank did with the Black money is that they used all that money for a lot of high risk projects and things, and it ended up foreclosing, and it cost Black people $3 million worth of Black wealth, and $3 million in, I want to say this was like 1880s, 1890s, right around that time. $3 million back then is like $1 billion now, basically. So that was another way. They used our money to do high risk trading and everything else, and lost it all. And no one's ever paid for that either. Just like whenever there's a thriving Black neighborhood, either one way or the other is going to get torn down.
Yeah, and you think about
jealousy of a neighboring white neighborhood that doesn't like the growth, or the government will just simply step in and take the land for themselves. such as Central Park. Central Park was once a thriving Black neighborhood in New York, and they just decided to tear that down and put up trees and rivers so white people can take jogs.
Eminent domain.
Yeah. And there's another one in LA too, where they've just generally seen where Black people are thriving, and then just decide, and the government steps in and takes the land. We'll just take the land, or they'll build some kind of start some project where there ends up tearing down a whole Black neighborhood to build a freeway system. All these kinds of things, and no one's ever paid for it. No one's ever given anything back for this. What they've gotten is their homes took and then called lazy because they have no home, even though it had nothing to do with their decisions. It's a very crooked system that has happened here. And there's so many cases of these kinds of things. I can name like 4 or 5 off the top, but there's got to be 30, 40 at least, where there were thriving Black neighborhoods, where the economy was thriving, business was there, Black banks, many Black businesses. We're talking about everything from bus stations and airports, doctors and lawyers, and whole Black banks that have just been wiped out. All that wealth just got wiped out, just simply because the government could. And no one's ever paid for that. No one's ever paid anyone back for any of that. And that's another reason why we're still in this perpetual state of running on a treadmill financially. Because once you do gain your footing, back then the system, well, even now they're just much slicker at it. It's not as obvious. Back then it was just obvious. They were just like, well, I'll take that. So that is part of the reason why the system is still what it is, and why we haven't monetarily gained any more wealth percentage-wise in this country than we did in slavery. It's the same percentage. We have 1.2% of the wealth during slavery, and now in 2022 we have like 1.4, maybe.
Well, that's why they're encouraging us to think differently about this word gap, right? So instead of thinking of it as that, we are at a deficit, or we, are kind of like we're not achieving where we should be achieving, we could also think about it as wealth being removed from our community. And so what we are looking more is more to have that wealth put back into our community that was already stolen from it. And so through, just like I was talking about education, that's the foundation of it, right? So we want to be able to teach our children more about ways that they can create wealth for themselves and teach them their history. And a lot of times it is, yes, can be through critical race theory, because a lot of students are just learning about white history and white ideals and white norms. And they never learn about the things that we may have learned about Black patents and all of that stuff that can be considered empowering for them to learn. And so as a result, they, those ideals just really perpetuate our own oppression. So we need to really change the conversation, and even the way that we talk about it as well, that we should not refer to our own selves from a deficit mindset or a deficit word choice, so that we are, minorities, or we are less than. We need to change just the way that we think and talk about ourselves as well. So I would just always challenge us to do that also.
Yeah, but
because that's often placed on us.
Yeah, I hear exactly what you're saying, and I agree with that. But here's the crazy thing about that statement, because just based on conversations that I've had with some white people, and I'm trying to figure this out about them, when we do give ourselves that kind of pride and insight, they don't like that. So then you're looked at, then there's a problem with us building ourselves up. You know what I'm saying? So that it's like the Black Lives Matter thing. The reason why white people hate it so much is not because of the lives matter part, it's only the Black. And that's something that when you carry that kind of pride with you, and there's a backlash to that kind of pride. So I don't know how that would how that affects the people who we have to go through to get the money and opportunities unless we're going to straight build our own opportunities from the ground up by ourselves, which is what we need to do. So if we're going to have that level of confidence, we need to have it all the way around. We need to build our own, start our own, and build from the ground up.
And hope that it doesn't.
Starting like we have nothing.
Well, we have the ability to. We have the ability to,
Yeah.
and we have a history of doing things on our own. We do have capital in our community, and we do have buying power in our community. It's more of a mindset of the educational aspects that would allow us not only to converge, but allow the people that are successful to reinvest in our communities as well. It's a concerted effort, because ultimately you look at some communities that are together and united, they are not concerned about the ideas or thoughts of the white community because they have capital and power. And we have the ability to do it. We just have to organize in a way that is our own interest. And that is something that we have been disenfranchised from each other. So we see each other not as supports, but
as rivals.
We have to do that a little bit better. And it is in our history, and we can do it. We just have to decide to.
Right. And
yeah, and it has a lot to do with the way we were brought up in this country. Because if you take a lot of people from the West Indies and everything else that come here from the other places, they have a sense of community. They understand. That's why even in the disparity because we all look the same in white eyes, but the culture of their community is not been brought up in this type of environment where it's a constant beatdown. So you're right, we have to find a way to build ourselves up as a community in order to flourish and move forward like everyone else.
Right. So this brings us a lot, you guys discussed a lot of possible solutions. So this brings us to our solution part. I heard working together, building up from our own. I'm gonna say, I know this is gonna be kind of controversial in itself, because this has been going on in like Congress. Should Black people get reparations for all these? And then I would say this is my solution would be reparation, but with education. You can't just give people money and just expect them to be able to use when they haven't been educated how to invest, how to do this and how to do that with the money. So reparations with the sense of education, like educate people how to invest, how to start their own businesses, and then we can come together as a community to do that. So I love the idea of just starting within ourselves, first getting over all of this competition among Black people, because it's not a competition. We are people. We should act as a people. Because that was one way they separated us too. When during slavery, they didn't have people from during slavery, they didn't have people from similar culture. And like when they captured us, they made sure that they were all over Africa. So that way you can't speak the same language and you can't communicate with each other. So I think we need to come together because they know the power of community. If we had community, those slave ships would never but there was you can't say 1 out of 10 is have rebellions, but that would have been a lot more rebellion going on if we all were from the same tribe. So coming back to the idea of establishing a true Black community, and then having reparations, and then teaching people how to use the money. I think that would solve this wealth gap. Not going to call it a gap, as Lauren said. Come up with a new word for the gap. But yeah, so that would be my solution. So anyone else has a solution? And then after we say our solutions, we're going to close out.
I'll go first on this one too, because we're basically on the same page. Now, just giving Black people one lump sum check is not the way that I would go about this, because there's not going to be a Jordan left in the country. We're going to buy them all. All right. All right, this is how this should work out. And I believe it should work out this way because most of our problems have been started and prolonged and governed by the actual government. So the thing that I propose is, for as long as we've gotten here to the point where we've gotten all the rights. I don't know how many years that is. Whatever amount of years that is, Black people in America should be able to live tax-free.
Ooh.
We should not have to pay taxes on anything. We get all of our check, we get all of everything. Completely tax-free, and the government, it's all based through the government. Now, with that becomes another responsibility, which you said, which is how to educate people on how to use money. So for as long as that period of time, for how many years has it been? What was it, about 400 years? So for 400 years, Black people get tax-free, and within that time, we have financial classes only for Black people from middle school on, from middle school, high school, and college, that are mandatory financial classes on how money works and how you're supposed to move your money and everything else. And that'll fix it, because no good having the money if you don't know how money works. So when you get the money, and it's not going to be like just you all of a sudden got $1 million just tax-free. You're going to learn how to take that extra money, and we can move that right there, and they'll teach us how to maneuver it so we can get into our own ownership and build our own wealth and everything else. So when it comes voting time, let the white people argue about their tax codes and everything else, because that won't be our problem for the next 400 years. We can vote strictly based on what are you going to do for us. That's my solution.
All right, Lauren, TJ, you guys got a solution?
Okay. Yeah, I like both of those solutions, Shanice and Greg. Man, with Greg's, I don't even know if I need the one I was thinking of. But like I had said earlier, a lot of the research that I had conducted, the common thread was always had to do with government, right? And the way that that's able to be achieved is that we don't have a seat at the table. Things change when you're in the room. If people talk about you behind your back, chances of them doing that in front of you, not really as great, right? If we can get our capable and intelligent Black folks in the room when there's legislation being made, that can be through state government offices, federal government offices, any of that, just to make sure that what little ground that we have been able to gain doesn't get pushed back again. I mean, I think even now that our right to vote isn't something that's secured. I mean, it's absurd. Don't you think? It's crazy. And I just think that the way that we have been suppressed is through legislation. Mm-hmm. We can have a seat at the table when legislation is being created. We can either stop it or at least make our communities aware of what's coming, and we can band together to figure out some way to get around it and to still keep things on the up and up. Education, of course, I definitely agree with that. Having money doesn't do you any good if you don't know how to keep it, right? And how to pass it on to the next generation. So education has definitely got to be a part of any solution that we come up with. But I sincerely think that we as a community need to have a bigger stake in the law and the system, so that we can thwart any attempts to keep us down through those means and mechanisms. Not everyone can be a congressman or senator or whatever, but you could be a lawyer. Even if you're not a lawyer or a judge, you can at least know your rights well enough to try to stop some of the community police violence and stuff like that, right? Knowing your rights is important. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, for me, aside from the great solutions I heard from Shanice and Greg, I'd like to add that as a potential to have a seat at the table.
Awesome. Lauren?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. What I would encourage for us to do is to work with our Black millionaires and billionaires that we have, because there's more than just Jay-Z and Dr. Dre out there. If they could work together to make some systems in place that would allow us to have our own schools and educational systems, and so then that way they would have less ability to get destroyed. I think it's also important that we do recognize that we, in the 60s and 70s and 20s and all throughout our history, we do have a history of having educational programs for our own, and we need to continue that for the future, so that we teach the values that are important to us. Like we talked about, capitalism really encourages individualism. It incentivizes profits. And we see now that many of our children are, really, they're just going after money and gold and things like that. And that's really not going to help their, spiritual understanding or their education or their thoughts about the community. And so we really need to encourage people of color and, of all different hues, that we really need to work together to make our community better. And so that is kind of the educational piece I think is important. I do think the money part is important as well. But I think just starting with don't buy all these different jewelry and all that other kind of stuff, invest and buy land and stuff. I think that's an important conversation to start. So that would be my solution, I guess. Education.
And I'd like to add one more thing to mind. Let's not do what we've done in the past, where we get these things and then all of a sudden let everyone else jump on the bandwagon. Make it Black and only Black, period. No one else. This is for us and us alone. Like it was supposed to be with affirmative action and everything else, but we decided to include white women and Spanish and everyone else, Latinos. We decided to include all these people. I don't want to include them at all, because no one included us when the Asians got their bill and they got beat up for 2 weeks. So I'm not including anyone else. When our bills, if it's for Blacks, it will be for Blacks and only Blacks.
And that's why they're not going to pass it.
You're 100% right. But that's what happened. What's the point of Devin? Never mind. Moving on.
On that wonderful ending note, that's all for today's beautiful struggle. Thank you for watching. You can see this and more at Black Advancement YouTube channel or on our website, www.blackadvancement.com. Until next time, peace and advance.